10. How are we going for time? We're going to have to keep moving. Myth number 10. If no specific back pain is found on your scans, your pain must be psychological. It's got to be all in your head. And I quite like this one. Sometimes pain can be in your head, sometimes my fist can be in your face. And similar to that is, if no specific back problem is found on scans, did I just say that?
Yeah.
Okay, if I've gone backwards, I have to. There we go. The amount of back pain correlates to the amount of back damage, and we can deal with those two together. This is a really interesting topic. So, because most of the time there isn't a specific structural thing found on an MRI, and that's the nature of back pain, for better or for worse. It's really different to if you've got an infection, and you can find out what that infection is, and then you can have the correct antibiotic for it. It's almost a linear process. Or you break a bone and you can see the x-ray, oh, that bone's broken, rightio, let's fix that bone, the bone's fixed. You know, there's a really step-by-step process, but back pain and neck pain as well is the same. It doesn't fit into that biomedical approach. And so you end up with a diagnosis for a lot of back pain which is non-specific low back pain, which is technically correct, but it's a really fluffy diagnosis. Like, I don't know that too many people would be real thrilled about getting the diagnosis of non-specific back pain, because it's really quite vague really, but it's probably the most correct diagnosis, because it's very rare for you to be able to say that is the structure at fault. And there are exceptions to that, of course, but for the majority, the diagnosis is not possible to be specific about it. So in terms of the question of psychological side of things, psychological factors can certainly, undoubtedly, have an effect on the amount of pain that you experience. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you're tired, if you've got stuff going on at work, if you've got stuff going on at home, they're all things that can affect the amount of pain you experience. But it doesn't mean that if there's nothing really seen on a scan, that it's all in your head. Pain, it's real. It's real. And that can be hard to accept if you're the person that's in pain. You really want to have something definite to show for it, don't you? And so following on from that is the question about the amount of pain. It isn't a reflection of the amount of tissue damage. And that's a statement that I know can be quite counterintuitive for a lot of people. You would think that if you have a certain amount of pain, there's a certain amount of injury, and the two should match. And I think I'm speaking for you, but I've grown up right up until I started learning a bit more about pain physiology. That's how I used to think too. You know, if it hurts this much, it must be this much injured, and it's simply not the way it is. And it's very clear now in the literature that that's not the way it is. Pain isn't a measure of tissue injury. Pain's a measure of how much protection your central nervous system, as in your brain and your spinal cord, how much protection your central nervous system deems that you need. So it's a very different concept to tissue injury. Now, the state of your tissue will come into it, but it's not the only factor by any stretch. So there's a whole lot of information that goes into that decision-making process. And a really important point, particularly if we're talking about someone that has persistent back pain that's been around for a long time, the longer the problem goes on for, the weaker the match is between the amount of tissue damage and the amount of pain. If you just sprain your ankle, you could argue that there's perhaps a closer match between the amount of pain that you're experiencing and the tissue damage, but then even that can change from hour to hour as well, so it's not equivalent. You can have really bad back pain and not have much to show for it on a scan, and you can have a horrible looking scan and not have much to show for it pain-wise too, so it goes both ways. And just to illustrate that point, I pulled this off the ABC website. this was in March, this poor woman that got stabbed at a train station in Perth, and she knew that she'd been stabbed because she had the feeling of the warm blood, spewing from her leg. But she said the weird thing about it was she didn't feel any pain, and you automatically think, oh yeah, she had adrenaline going through her system, and all this stuff was going on. But that's exactly the point, that you would think if someone's been stabbed, there would be a zillion receptors in her leg that would have been screaming, tissue injury, damage, damage, damage. But the fact that she didn't feel any pain, it just demonstrates that your central nervous system's got the ability to filter, to change and to influence the amount of pain you experience. Tissue injury and the amount of pain isn't an equivalent. And that's a really, really big concept, and it's a hard one to get your head around, I think, for a lot of people. I've found it took me a good while to really get my head around that idea too. But it all comes down to the fact that you've got this fantastic thing inside your skull here that's taking on a whole stack of information that you're conscious of and you're not conscious of, and it's whizzing through it all the time, and it's making decisions that are in your best interests. And sometimes it's in your best interest not to feel pain. And the reverse can happen too. It can be an extra uber protective system that makes you really, really aware of what's going on in your body, and almost be too protective. And that's often the case for people that have persistent pain problems.
Would that be like spasm? Is that equivalent?
We'll talk about spasm in a moment. That's actually one of the things that we'll talk about, because that kind of fits into the same category, the thought that if you have a certain amount of spasm, there's got to be a certain amount of injury. And that's... It's part of your protective system. Yeah, spasm is part of your protective system in the same way that pain is. And there's a whole raft of systems that get involved when something's going on. It's not just pain and it's not just spasm. You get immune system changes, you get respiratory changes, your language changes. There's a whole lot of things that come into play. But yeah, I'll deal with that a little bit more in a moment, because that's a good point. Okay, so, and as we've just talked about, it's an important side note. Strictly speaking, pain is all in your head, but not in the way that people usually use that term, not it's all in your head. Well, actually it is, but it's because your brain is the thing that creates the experience of pain. In the same way that your brain is the thing that creates the experience of love or frustration or anxiety. They're brain constructions, and pain's just the same. It's very different to saying that it's psychological.